On the evening of Tuesday, May 19th, 2026, London, Ontario was struck by a violent line of severe thunderstorms.
Man, that's a tornado. My car! Oh, man! Tampa gone, baby.
That turned an ordinary spring evening into a citywide emergency. Tornado warnings flashed across phones. Winds powerful enough to topple mature trees tore through neighborhoods. Power lines came down. Streets disappeared behind sheets of rain and blowing debris. And even before officials could say with certainty whether a tornado had touched down, damage was already telling its own story. What moved into London that night was not just a thunderstorm. It was a fast-moving, highly unstable weather system that forced an entire region to confront the difference between a warning on a screen and a storm arriving at the front door. Earlier in the day, there was very little in the city itself to suggest how dangerous the evening would become. London had been sitting under unusually warm air for 2 days, the kind of early season heat that makes southern Ontario feel briefly suspended between spring and summer. Roads were busy. Neighborhoods were quiet. In East London, in South London, and across Middlesex County, people were still moving through familiar routines, while the atmosphere above them was quietly becoming more unstable. Forecasters had already begun watching the collision that was setting up over the region. A sharp cold front pushing into warm, moisture-laden air, the exact kind of boundary that can turn scattered storms into something more organized and far more dangerous. By late afternoon, the ingredients were no longer subtle. The air had become tense, heavy, and primed for severe weather. What remained uncertain was not whether storms would arrive, but how hard they would hit when they did. The first real shift came not from what people saw, but from what they heard and felt. Phones lit up with emergency alerts. Environment Canada issued tornado warnings for London and nearby areas as a severe line of storms pushed in from the west. Residents were told to take immediate shelter, move to lower levels, stay away from windows, and wait for the threat to pass. That guidance turned the storm from background noise into something deeply personal. The wind was no longer just forecast wind. It was now a threat, moving toward homes, apartment blocks, side streets, parked cars, and anyone still outside. In city after city, the emotional turning point in a storm like this arrives with that alert tone. It is the moment people stop watching the weather and start measuring the distance to the basement, the hallway, the safest room in the house. In London that evening, the warnings carried a second layer of fear. The possibility of rotation. The possibility that inside this larger storm line, something smaller and more violent might be forming. Then the city began to feel the force of it. In East London, especially around Argyle and Burnside Drive, trees came down hard enough to rip into power lines, vehicles, fences, and front yards. Residents later described the rain turning so thick it became almost impossible to see through, as if the neighborhood had briefly vanished behind a white wall of water and motion. One family looked out just in time to see a tree coming toward them before rushing to the basement. Another emerged after the worst had passed to find a large uprooted tree blocking the driveway. At least one car was hit by a fallen tree and entangled with a downed power line. By 7 in the evening, London Hydro reported that more than 2,000 customers in the Argyle area were without electricity. This was not abstract storm damage spread across radar pixels. It was immediate, local, physical damage, measured in snapped trunks, severed wires, and the sickening sound of heavy things falling where people had been standing moments earlier. As the line pushed across the city, the visual evidence became more unsettling. In Westmount, one resident captured what appeared to be a rotating funnel cloud outside a window, while warnings remained active across the region. Whether a tornado actually touched down in or near London was still unconfirmed that evening, but the atmosphere had already crossed into the kind of territory where confirmation almost felt secondary to experience. The damage was real. The fear was real. The city's fire department was already responding to multiple calls involving downed trees and power lines, much of it concentrated in the East End.
About 5 minutes
Across London, the storm was leaving behind the same pattern that severe convective systems leave when they begin interacting with neighborhoods instead of open fields. Sudden disruption, fragmented damage, and a sense that the city had been struck in pieces, block by block, rather than all at once. If you want more verified disaster breakdowns told with this level of detail, consider subscribing. London was only one part of the story. The storm line did not stall over the city. It kept moving east, carrying the same tornadic potential and destructive wind threat toward Woodstock, Brantford, and Brant County. By the time warnings were extended into those communities, the system had become a broader southwestern Ontario event rather than a single city emergency. Officials warned of damaging wind gusts, hail, and dangerous rotation embedded inside the line. Farther east, thunderstorm warnings remained in effect into the evening for areas east of Hamilton and into Niagara. That widening footprint matters because it changes the scale of what viewers are seeing. This was not an isolated burst of weather over one urban center. It was a regional outbreak moving rapidly across one of the most populated corridors in the province, touching homes, roads, hydro infrastructure, and emergency services across multiple jurisdictions in just a matter of hours.
The science behind it was dramatic, but not mysterious. Southern Ontario had spent 2 days under unusually warm air. That warmth mattered because it loaded the atmosphere with energy. Then a sharp cold front swept in.
Holy fuck!
Storms were able to organize and violent tornado winds kilometers an hour, and in some cases up to 100
The underneath, but I just saw it. It connected down.
And the result is a system capable of doing very different kinds of damage in very short distances. One neighborhood might lose trees and power. Another might see hail. Another might report a funnel cloud. That is what makes severe weather in this region so difficult to process in real time. It is not one clean disaster. It is multiple hazards arriving at once, each one unfolding at street level.
By the time the worst of the line had passed through London, the response phase was already underway. The city said it received at least 50 reports of downed trees after the storm. Crews were sent out to clear blocked roads and deal first with the most urgent hazards: trees on homes, trees on cars, trees across streets, and lines pulled down into public spaces. That order of priorities says a lot about what storms like this leave behind. The danger does not end when the thunder moves away. It lingers in unstable branches, dark intersections, damaged roofs, and live wires hidden in wet debris. For residents, the emotional rhythm changes again here. The first phase is fear during the warning. The second is shock during impact. The third is the strange, careful silence that follows, when people step outside and start looking for what the storm chose to take. And if you follow severe weather because the details matter as much as the footage, consider subscribing for more grounded documentary coverage. What made the night especially unsettling was the uncertainty that remained, even after the warnings were lifted. Officials were still assessing whether a tornado had actually touched down. That gap between visible damage and formal confirmation is part of what makes severe weather coverage so complicated. Residents do not wait for a survey team to know what they felt. They know the sound. They know the pressure change. They know the instant a normal storm stops sounding normal. But investigators still have to determine whether the damage was caused by straight-line winds, a tornado, or both. In London, that uncertainty hung over the aftermath. A possible funnel cloud had been seen. Tornado warnings had been issued. Trees were down, hydro service was interrupted, and neighborhoods had clearly taken a hit. But the final classification of the event was still pending. And that mattered, because official confirmation changes how a storm is remembered, documented, and compared to the ones that came before it.
By late evening, the warnings had finally been lifted across southwestern Ontario, but the system had left a broad mark across the region. What had started as a severe weather setup over warm, unstable air had turned into a chain of local emergencies, stretching across London, Middlesex County, and communities farther east. The footage that emerged from the city was not cinematic in the grand Hollywood sense. It was more unsettling than that. A tree torn onto a car, a driveway blocked by roots and branches, fences bending, power gone, residents in basements waiting for the noise above them to stop. That is how many real weather disasters look at street level, not as one spectacular image, but as dozens of private moments of disruption happening at the same time. If you want more real, carefully researched disaster documentaries like this, consider subscribing for the next one.
And that may be the most honest way to remember the London storm of May 19, 2026. Not as a single clip of wind or one dramatic warning banner, but as the evening a dangerous weather line swept into a heavily populated part of Ontario and forced thousands of people into the same fragile calculation. How much time is left? Where is the safest place in this building? And will the damage stop at the tree line or keep coming? By night's end, power was out in parts of the city. Roads and driveways were blocked, emergency crews were stretched, and the final survey work was still ahead. The emotional outline of the event was already clear. London had been reminded, in a matter of minutes, that severe weather in southern Ontario can move from forecast to frontline with almost no margin at all.